Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to the Institute and the American University and to Professor Jalto for pigeonholing me into this. It's a great pleasure. Thanks very much for bringing me here. So, you know, the topic that I fastened on is how far should religious intolerance be tolerated? But I'll maybe approach it from maybe a personal view. So maybe start with some personal reflections before we get into more of the substance. Just a little bit about my own background. My grandparents migrated from the Punjab, which was northern British India, to British Columbia, settling on Vancouver Island. Just a year after the first 1905 Russian Revolution. So if you think of the first Russian Revolution of 1905, so just a year after that, so a long time back. In 1950, my father became the first Canadian of Indian origin to join the Federal Public Service. So what happened was my mother and father moved from Vancouver in 1950 to Ottawa, and they're minimally observant Sikhs, you know, from Sikh heritage, Sikh religion. So they moved from the West Coast to Ottawa, where I was later born. And for several years, we were the only Canadians with Indian roots in Ottawa. So, and I confess that growing up in the 1960s and 1970s in Ottawa, religion commanded actually very little of our family's attention compared to the Vietnam War, Biafra, Quebec separatism, perpetual crises in the Middle East, civil wars in Lebanon and Cambodia, famine in Africa, the Cold War, the twists and turns of the Cold War, and other political events that you find splashed across the TV and the newspapers every day. And whenever proselytizers came to our doors, some Sundays, my parents always welcomed them into our home to discuss faith and religion, etc. Also, my dad used to do it a little bit for sport. I think so, but you know, it's a little bit tormenting, but a little bit, you know, always logic and argument. So very open and tolerant in that sense. And as we know, the world's major religions promote, or can promote, peace, justice, social harmony, and that only happens when people are willing to talk and exchange views. So it's a good concept to have all different views as we are through this forum. And it hardly needs to be said that religious institutions around the globe have been really powerful instruments of charity, of good works, social welfare, moral education, and intercultural understanding. So if you look, you know, all around the world, all religions, all the major religions have really been, have done a lot of good things. But as we also know, religious doctrine, including Christian theology, has also been used to justify slavery in the New World, colonialism in Africa, and elsewhere for centuries. And every religion has been used by some to excuse the severest violations of human rights. Now, Canada is proud of its bilingual heritage, and it's rightfully lauded for its official policy of multiculturalism that was inaugurated in 1971 by the Trudeau government. The Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the father of the present Prime Minister, and admired for its very high levels of diversity and cultural and religious tolerance. And I had a great upbringing there. It was very happy upbringing. I do remember as a 10-year-old wondering why I had to pretend to recite the Lord's Prayer, which was a mandatory exercise in a school day every day. So I used to kind of stand up, and you know, there were all the other students there, and I was the only kind of, you know, brownish kid there. And they were all doing the Lord's Prayer, so I kind of like, but I thought that was a bit odd, you know, because I thought this is a public school, it's a secular school. In fact, in 1988, the Ontario Court of Appeal struck down this exercise because they said, no, it's a mandatory thing, and it shouldn't be because it's politically insensitive, it's not very inclusive. Not that there's very much objectionable about the Lord's Prayer, but it does reflect the way it's worded, only a certain tradition and not others. More recently, maybe much more seriously, it's become widely known that some of Canada's worst cultural assimilation policies, such as forcible relocation of Indigenous children from their families into residential schools, were managed and implemented by religious institutions. And those institutions perpetrated horrific levels of sexual abuse and violence in these residential schools. So we had these Indigenous populations, and they said, well, you know, in order to integrate them, to assimilate them into a Christian way of life, and this was supported by the government, they have to be taken away from their parents and put into these schools where they're basically incarcerated. And of course, a lot of abuse happened there. Victims are still suffering, you know, very long after the last residential church school was closed in 1996. So there's been a lot of suicide. There has been a lot of recourse to alcohol and drugs. In 2006, so just 11 years ago, and you know, this had gone on for decades, from 1860, 1880, all the way to, you know, as I say, the last school was closed in 1996. The Canadian government allocated $6 billion Canadian dollars for survivors' reparations. That includes compensation and other forms of redress. Many Protestant churches and a few Catholic entities, look, we're going lower and lower, apologized explicitly for the sexual abuse, violence, systematic disrespect of native culture and language, and for forcing ideologies of European cultural superiority upon Indigenous peoples. I mean, it's really quite a shameful thing, because first, you know, the land and the culture is taken away by European invaders, and then the culture is denigrated very badly, systematically through this process. So many victims have had just a lot of difficulties in recovering, as I've said. Unfortunately, religious cleavages, dangerous religious cleavages, are not just ancient histories. We know from traumatic violence in former Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. And you know, I was in also Rwanda. You mentioned maybe my work for the Security Council, Paul, as special investigator for the UN Security Council's Commission of Experts in Rwanda. And that was just a few months after the genocide. 800,000 civilians were slaughtered, and I was doing massacre site investigations there. So I was dumbfounded to learn that some priests and nuns were directly participating in the killings, and even in targeting some of the Tutsis. One Catholic priest ordered the deliberate bulldozing of a church, knowing that 2,000 Tutsis were hiding inside. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda prosecuted and jailed some of the priests. Others escaped, and they're living quietly in Europe and Africa, according to our best knowledge. In March, to his credit, Pope Francis went to Rwanda and asked for forgiveness. We could cite endless examples of persecution and outright violence from other religions as well. Blasphemy and apostasy laws in many countries. Extremely harsh punishment in many Islamic jurisdictions, not to mention systematic violations of the human rights of women in all religions, but the Islamic jurisdictions do not have a very good record there, to say the least. Persecution of Ahmadiyya Muslims and Christians in Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia. Nationalist Hindu persecution of Muslims in India. You can basically find pretty severe religious intolerance examples if you go to any country, and just about from really all religions. I can't think of a religion that has not been involved in very, very serious human rights violations. Or I should say that by the followers of religions, because obviously there's a distinction, I should hope. All this explains my personal distrust of self-righteousness and cultural superiority, and doctrines that consistently excuse systematic domination and abuse of the less powerful, whether it's inside or outside religious structures and institutions. It also explains why, in my early university years, I found Marx, Engels, Lenin particularly persuasive and refreshing. History as class struggle, imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, colonialism as violation of the right of peoples to self-determination, science over superstition and idolatry, and religion the opiate of the masses. And of the countless revolutions that the world has seen, the Russian Revolution, the October Revolution, really still stands out above the rest for its compelling messages of solidarity with the worldwide proletariat, the downtrodden and subjugated masses under capitalist exploitation, and its commitment to fight colonial enslavement. Who could not be inspired by Lenin, Castro, Che Guevara's visions of justice, equality, and utopia? Yet, long before Solidarność in Poland, and the eventual fall of the Berlin Wall, communism's internal inconsistencies, contradictions, and its own systematic violation of basic human rights across Warsaw Pact countries, including of fundamental principles of democracy and the rule of law, freedom of movement, of speech, of freedom of religion, of association, and of so many other rights and freedoms, very much contrasts starkly with its political messianism and utopian classlessness, and it nags at one's conscience. Die-hard admirers of Lenin, don't look so glum. Die-hard admirers of Lenin and vanguardism also suffered a rude awakening when the USSR disappeared, because then a lot of information started to come out. Soviet archives opened up and were newly open to the public, and they exposed Lenin's personal orders and responsibility for murder, summary executions, torture, and systematic terror for the whole world to see. Because before that, we could say it was Felix Dzerzhinsky, Lavrenti Beria, Stalin, could always blame them. But since the archives were opened up, so if you're a die-hard Leninist, you could always say, well, Lenin was sacrosanct. But if you read Dmitry Volkodonov and the axe to grind, who was the Soviet archivist, you see Lenin's record is actually not very nice. It's pretty disturbing. Putting aside the vexing question as to whether it's even fair to judge the moral worth of religion or ideology by the sins of their followers, at least one thing seems clear. So, you know, the point I just said, you can take any ideology or religion and say that the followers have done this, therefore the religion, the ideology is false. And one can see whether that's fair or not fair. I think religion and ideology, personally, probably, you know, the followers have to take responsibility, and it reflects, it depends. Some of the religion and ideologies are maybe wrong in many ways. But certainly there's a fairness question. A follower does something, do you then use that to paint everybody with the same brush? Obviously there's some difficulties. But I think the point should be maybe that any regime, whether it's religious, ideological, political, or legal, that relies predominantly on force to ensure conformity and cohesion, has to be considered highly suspect, particularly from the moment it overrides, ignores, or violates human dignity in some way or other. Whether it's Leninism, whether it's Bolshevik creed, whether it's any religious creed, any ideology. Because the ends cannot justify the means. Human rights violations are not only wrongs in themselves, but they vitiate any claim to legitimacy. They store up resentment on the part of victims and entire communities that simmer as conflict and can threaten the peace. It's true that all major religions preach peace and tolerance of others, and by and large, people have gotten along peacefully, I'm going to look at it that way, for millennia, side by side, different faiths. But it's also true that, and it's been mentioned today, this morning, that with terrifying regularity, zealotry and excessive conformity produce intolerance of dissent, violence against non-believers, and sometimes full-scale, devastating religious war. How, when and where religion promotes violence and war instead of peace and harmony, I think it's a very complex question, right? And scholars are going to continue to debate that. What matters more, in my opinion, from a practical peace and security point of view, is the extent to which people of different faiths, beliefs, ethnicities, and cultural backgrounds who are increasingly pushed into closer and closer contact with one another as our world becomes increasingly globalized. The extent to which they practice mutual respect and observe fully cultural and religious pluralism from the level of interpersonal relations all the way up to interstate relations and global politics. That raises the question how far religious intolerance should be tolerated, and who should be doing that, if anybody should be doing that regulating. It's difficult to answer in the abstract, but much guidance on how to approach these kind of questions comes directly from the international law of human rights. And it's no accident of history that the right to freedom of religion or belief forms actually part of the foundation of international law and the modern system of international relations, including the post-World War II human rights movement. 500 years ago, Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses attacking the Catholic doctrine of indulgences and fracturing Catholic dominance over state institutions in Europe. You have then the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, where the principle of cuius religio, eius religio, that a prince could choose whether to affiliate himself with Catholicism or Lutheranism, and to designate his subjects in the same faith. But the Peace of Augsburg was not only an early attempt to institutionalize religious toleration, but it presaged the treaties of Osnabrück and Münster, that brought a formal end to the 30 Years' War and ushered in the and ended dominance of the Holy Roman Empire and ushered in the Peace of Westphalia. And the Peace of Westphalia, in 1648, established that each sovereign had an exclusive right to rule within the territory of his or her state. Each sovereign state was equal to every other. That the treaties of Munster and Osnabrück themselves had to be respected. And aggressive war against another sovereign state was illegitimate. That's the foundations of international law in 1648, and the modern system of international relations. So it has a very close connection to the whole question of religious tolerance. So the very foundations of international law arose very much as an effort to contain and prevent the destructive forces unleashed by religious persecution. It's a lesson that unfortunately had to be relearned after in the aftermath of the Second World War. Because, you know, for another century and a half, the Peace of Westphalia, the rules of international law were basically designed to keep states peacefully apart. And then you got some rules of cooperation in the Vienna Congress in 1815, and minority rights protections, until we get Hitler using minority rights as a pretext to intervene in other countries. You know, the minority rights of German minorities in neighboring countries, and then to actually invade. Which is why this misuse of minority rights, that's why President Franklin Roosevelt in his 4 freedoms included religious tolerance as a key pillar, alongside freedom from fear, freedom of speech, freedom from want. Basically, that religious tolerance, the right to freedom of religion, has to be enjoyed by everyone, everywhere around the globe. I think I have a couple more minutes, but how is the 4 more minutes? Because I have to. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. Because you got 6, I think.
Oh, thank you. Because you were boring otherwise. Borrowing from my.
No, you got 6.
Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights declares that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, which includes the right to change his religion or belief, and freedom to either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. And if you look at the Universal Declaration, which is a non-binding instrument of the United Nations General Assembly, you know, it's an important statement for universal rights. And it was followed up by binding treaties, multilateral human rights treaties, which have been very widely ratified by almost all countries of the world. So you find also Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights guarantees the freedom to have or adopt a religion or belief. But it doesn't refer to explicitly to the right to change one's religion. So something happened between 1948 and 1966 when the binding instrument was developed. When it came to the Universal Declaration, it's non-binding, everybody agrees, everybody has no problem at the United Nations. Actually, it was only a relatively small number of countries in the world, I guess about 60 at the time, members of the UN. But something happened between 1948 and 1966. It instead says, no one shall be subject to coercion, which would impair his or her freedom to have or to adopt a religion or belief of his choice by Article 82. We'll get to that in a moment. I also want to say that in international human rights law, there's an Article 4, Paragraph 2, which designates certain rights, certain human rights, including freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, as non-derogable, which means you can't suspend it If you have freedom of speech, it can be limited, it can be suspended in wartime or a national public emergency. But freedom of religion or conscience or belief can never be suspended. So you can't touch it. It's one of the special category of rights within international human rights law. So the state really has a heavy obligation there, a very strict obligation. Let me skip forward just a little bit to say that there's another major instrument, which is that in 1981, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a declaration, which is called the Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Intolerance and of Discrimination based on Religion or Belief. And it very clearly links the right to freedom of religion or belief to peace and security, and builds on the Universal Declaration and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Now what happened was, the right to change your belief suddenly became very controversial. And the reason was, and that's why you don't find it only a hint of it in the earlier instruments. Because Muslim law generally considers conversion from Islam to any other religion as an act of blasphemy. So Muslims generally objected to language in these instruments that would have made converting from one religion to another an unqualified grant. Based on this belief, many Muslim religions or regimes have little tolerance for non-Muslim missionaries. Like, I wouldn't recommend, people go do some missionary activity in Saudi Arabia, for example. I don't think it's, a very good, clever thing to do. I think it might be risky. People do it, or Afghanistan, but they've also been taken hostage and tortured. So there's very little tolerance for it. Accordingly, references to the right to change one's religion were deleted from the text in this non-binding declaration of 1981. But in the drafting process, there are others who said, look, you got to be free to believe what you want. You can't be locked up in your own. The state and the community cannot lock you up in your own religion, whatever religion you were born into. So there was a counter movement, and they couldn't get the freedom to change your religion back into the declaration. But what happened was that there was a clause added that said the 1981 declaration cannot be interpreted in such a way as to conflict with the Universal Declaration. So somehow they didn't notice that, but the Universal Declaration is very explicit. You have a right to change your religion or belief. So it's imported back. This is the kind of things that happens in the United Nations, in drafting, and coming up with legal texts. So it's back in a way. So by this roundabout reference. So it's in through the back door. And just 2 more minutes, one or 2 more minutes. The General Assembly, Declaration 1981, which makes interesting reading if you want to dig it up, 1981 Declaration on the right to freedom of religion or belief, says that religion can be subject to limitations, but such limitations should be as narrow as possible, as are prescribed by law and are necessary to protect public safety, order, health, or morals. So here we get into the question, how much can you restrict a religion or belief? So any limitation on the exercise of right to freedom of religion or belief must be done through law, has to be constitutionally authorized by implication, and can only be done for public safety, order, health, morals, the fundamental rights and freedoms of others, rather than for some other purpose, like you just don't like it. In effect, the approach taken in the 1981 Declaration represents a fairly strong, I would say universal, consensus on the boundaries for how far religious intolerance can be tolerated. Article 2 establishes that no one shall be subject to discrimination by any state, institution, group of persons, or persons on the grounds of religion or other belief. So it's a big non-discriminatory clause. Article 3 adds that discrimination is an affront, and it goes on, and it links it to friendly and peaceful relations. In short, to come to the conclusion, the international community is affirmed through its legally binding human rights treaties and through the non-binding 1981 UN General Assembly Declaration that states are obliged to take effective measures to prevent and eliminate discrimination, to reform law to combat intolerance on the basis of religion or belief, safeguard the parents or legal guardians of the child to organize their family according to their own religion or belief, including to respect the right of every child to have access to education in religion or belief, in line with the parents' or legal guardians' wishes, and not to be compelled to receive teaching on religion or belief against those wishes, subject to the best interests of the child as the guiding principle. Yet, this guidance remains very general in scope and application. It's up to the courts in every country to strike the right balance between the right to freedom of religion or belief and other human rights according to the prevailing customs and mores of the community. At least the international community, I can say, has concluded as a universal principle that for the sake of international peace and security, tolerating religious intolerance cannot go so far as to violate international human rights law in specific concrete instances, and it is up to states to ensure that all entities within their jurisdiction follow this prescription as a matter of law, policy, and practice. Thanks very much.